Harry didn't actually say anything, but I could tell he wasn't happy about getting off the train at Cochrane Siding. However, I had paid the train fare for us, the gear and horses, so I thought it was my call. I expect that's why he didn't actually voice his displeasure. On the other hand, he was the quiet type. It was hard to get him to express an opinion on anything unless you goaded him into it. Or if you did something more than a little foolish, there would be some comment designed to ensure you had learned something from your mistake. Perhaps it would have been better had he said something that time. Had he talked me into staying aboard until we reached Calgary, things might have turned out a lot different. We originally mounted the train at Donald Siding, east of Farwell. We trailed up from Farwell to Donald to avoid having to climb Big Hill inside a train which often lost traction on that hill, leading to all manner of excitement, which I didn't need. We rode the rest of the way on the train for the same reason most people do. It's a lot easier on horses, riders, and equipment going through the mountains with steam doing the pulling. In addition, one needs to consider the weather, for even though the winter had been extremely mild, the high country can give a man some fatal surprises, even in late spring. Those big snow throwers the railroad used can be the difference between making the trip and leaving a pile of old bones alongside the trail for the coyotes and wolves to fight over. In Cochrane, however, the weather was fine, if anything too warm, and I wanted to see some country. I also expected to be staying in that area for a while, and I wanted to get used to the land while we spent a few days riding on into Calgary. Not that I was completely ignorant of what to expect. I had spent several hours over campfires and in saloons, particularly during the previous winter, talking with those who knew the eastern slope and the foothills. For instance, I knew there were several large ranches in the country, most of them owned by men from other parts of the world. Often these large spreads were owned by a group of people or what was called a combine. Some of those owners had even seen the land and stock that ran on it, but not many. In between these big outfits were smaller outfits run by one man and his family or a small partnership. Most of these ranches were located between the rail line, or the Bow River which it paralleled, and the U.S. border, but a few had holdings north of the river. The siding where we unloaded was on the north bank of the Bow, at the headquarters of one of the better managed of those ranches, known, as you might have guessed, as the Cochrane Ranch. Things were changing on the Cochrane that spring of '86. They had just lost their foreman, Jim Dunlap, who many considered the best cattleman in the country. He had been riding north from Fort Macleod to the ranch the previous winter when he froze his feet. He would not let them cut. It took some time, but those frozen feet eventually killed him. The hands at the siding tried to be friendly, but Harry and I could see they were in no mood for visiting strangers. We told them how sorry we were, which doesn't do much good at a time like that. Then we rode east along the tracks a couple of miles and camped for the night. The next morning, as we rode on east toward Calgary, I finally got a chance to see the country. Most of what I had been told was true. The more I saw of that eastern slope, the more I liked it. It was close to noon before we met the first discouraging thing, although it took us several minutes to realize it. It was a man of perhaps 250 pounds riding a 1,600-pound horse. He came out of the bush on the east side of a draw we were about to climb into that ran uphill off to our left. He was followed by two average-sized men on two average-sized horses. We didn't know he was a sorry cuss at that moment, but it didn't take us long to find out. They sat and watched us approach for a few moments. Our pack horses were free and followed well, but just in case, I dropped back and pulled the halter shank out from under a pack rope. Passing the lead behind my back to my left hand, I flipped it over Blackie's rump and looped it around the saddle horn. When Harry saw that, he dropped back and did the same with the other pack animal. The three strangers rode down into the draw and up our side to meet us. The way they jerked their mounts to a halt justified my leading the pack horse. I put a half-hitch slip in the lead rope so I wouldn't have to hold it. All three of them wore the tall-crowned, big-brimmed hat of the time over hair too long and dirty. Their high-heeled boots, too narrow for their feet, branded them as cattlemen. They all wore handlebar mustaches, usual for the time, but were otherwise clean-shaven, which was not always usual for men riding the range. The two average-sized men wore stovepipe chaps over canvas pants, cotton shirts, one blue and one red, cowhide vests, and red neckerchiefs. The big man wore wool pants, a plaid flannel shirt, tweed vest fully buttoned with a watch chain stretching across his ample middle, and a blue bandana. They all wore Colt pistols, the younger and smaller man carrying two, hung with butts forward. They drew up abreast, no more than 2 feet between each of their mounts. The youngster, who by the appearance of his weapons and how he wore them seemed to think he was a gunfighter, was in the center. This young fellow and his appearance drew my attention more than he should have. Riding alone in the wilderness, or working with wild cattle and horses, it always makes sense to wear a handgun. But in those days, many people couldn't afford a handgun, let alone two, and wearing them butt forward, as this young man did, meant they would be catching on things like his rope and the brush as he was trying to do the work of a cowhand. Therefore, I suspected he was probably a poor range rider and a good troublemaker. I should have ignored him and paid more attention to his riding partners. The way the three of them charged right up to us and stopped so close didn't add to my feeling of comfort. They were crowding us and had an arrogant manner about them. I didn't like the look in their eyes, and I was glad I had taken the pack-horse lead shank. Even though he was a few years older than me, Harry Gilmore always followed my lead. Part of the reason was that up until the fall before, I had been his boss for over a year. Mostly, though, it was because he was part Sioux. Although few people ever knew that, and several years of folks tramping on him and his people meant that he generally followed and kept his mouth shut. What that meant for me at the time was that I knew I would be handling the conversation with the fat man, and I could depend on Harry to back me up, whatever happened. "Where do you think you're going?" the fat man asked. Maybe my confidence in Harry's loyalty and ability made me a little too mouthy in my response to the big man's arrogant manner, and, as I said, I was paying too much attention to the gunman and not enough to the fat man. "East," I replied. He tried to stare me down. I smiled, and he shifted his gaze to Harry, rolling his chew around in his mouth. He forced his big horse forward a few steps so that its head was on Blackie's offside, its nose about a foot from my right knee. "Where did you come from?" he asked, bringing his gaze back to me. "West," I replied. He spit tobacco juice at Blackie's cheek. Blackie was a good horse, but he wouldn't put up with very much foolishness even from me. He was also one of the fastest animals I ever rode. It seemed that stream of tobacco juice was still in the air when he turned and bit the fat man's horse on the shoulder. 1,600 pounds of horse squealed and jumped to the left, blood flowing from a 3-inch gash and down its leg. The horse ridden by the young gunfighter, at least 600 pounds lighter than the fat man's horse, was too close and no match for the bigger animal. Rider and horse hit the ground hard. The mustang grunted, squealed, and jumped to its feet. The rider's left foot was caught in the stirrup as the horse lunged away from another collision. The fat man put his hand on his pistol and turned his gaze from the Donnybrook back to me. His hand froze when he found my Colt was already in my hand. I didn't point it at him, just let it hang there, muzzle down, my forearm resting on the horn. Very slowly, he put his right hand back on top of his left, which rested on his own saddle horn. At the same time, the third rider shook out a loop and turned his mount toward the bucking mustang and dragging rider. Within 100 feet he had the animal roped. It stood on the end of the lariat with legs spread wide and vibrated. The bundle attached to the stirrup didn't move. "I'm Portis Martin," the fat man said. I was doing my best to maintain a calm, this is an everyday thing appearance, but was in fact having a tough time with that. Not only had I been approached poorly in a generally friendly land, but one of my best friends had just been spit on. "Henry James," I responded. "Some folks call me Hank, but you can call me Mr. James." Without taking my eyes from him, I inclined my head to indicate my saddle partner. "This here is Mr. Gilmore." The roper dismounted on the offside and, speaking slowly and calmly, worked his way up the rope to the frightened horse. Martin made a sweeping motion with his arm. "This is all my land, and the cattle on it are mine," he said. "Them horses you're ridin' are a whole lot better than any drifter'd be usin', or cowpunchers, for that matter." The other rider took a grip on the headstall on the shaky animal. Very slowly he reached for the stirrup and released his partner's foot. He led the horse off a few steps, and then returned and knelt by the motionless body. I had to give Martin high marks for guts. Like I said, I wasn't pointing it at him, but I had a loaded Colt in my hand, and he was calling me a thief. At the same time, I had to give him fairly low marks for smart. "Are you calling me a rustler?" I asked. He smiled. "Well, I don't see no cows with you, but it's been a while since I seen drifters with enough truck they gotta have pack horse to haul it. And like I said, you're on my land." "Thought this was the Cochrane Ranch," I said. "You rode off it a ways back," he said. "This land here, and the land north of Cochrane right to the mountains, is my problem." "Looks to me like a railroad track over there," I noted. I didn't turn to look at it, but kept my eyes on Martin. "Right smart for a Yankee," Martin responded. I ignored the attempted insult. During my years in the country, I had tried to lose my American way of speech, but it appeared I had not been completely successful. "Be about 50 yards?" I asked. "I reckon," he nodded, his expression somewhat puzzled. "Railroad claims 100 yards each side of the roadbed," I informed him. "That means we ain't on your land. They also claim alternating sections on each side of the rails, so a lot of what you're claiming ain't yours." Martin worked his jaw for a moment, and then sent another stream of tobacco juice into the dust. He made a point of missing Blackie. "Ain't no never mind," he said. "Ain't no railroad man out here. Me that runs this country." "Too bad," I said, putting my pistol back in the leather. "What's that supposed to mean?" he fired back. "Country's liable to go all to hell," I replied. "One of your men just got himself squished and dragged. If he's lucky, he won't have more than a broken leg. For 10 minutes you've been arguing with me, and you ain't even looked at him. You look after the country same way you look after your hands. Why, I reckon we're all in trouble." I turned black, and we started away. "Don't make no never mind for you," Martin said. I looked over my shoulder at him, and he continued, "You'll be leaving." "Don't reckon so," I said, then added, before he could threaten me if I stayed, "You claiming all this land that ain't yours makes me wonder if maybe we should ask the Mounties to see if you're claiming cows that ain't yours." Martin smiled. "Rode into this country in '74 with them boys. Got me 2 stripes before I took to raising beef." This was not news that I found comforting. However, I didn't let it show and just smiled. "Then they won't likely be too surprised when I describe our meeting here today." Harry and I rode on, being sure to stay within the railroad right-of-way.